Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to XL Catlin Coral Live. We're here on Trunk Island, a nature reserve managed by the Bermuda Zoological Society. And we've been working with the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences and the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo for the past couple of weeks, bringing some of Bermuda's amazing marine life to classes. Thank you very, very much for tuning into this YouTube live session. My name's Jamie with Digital Explorer, and we'll be trying to answer some of your questions from around the world. Now, we've a bit late on this one because we've been sort of jiggling around. Big clouds up here, can't quite decide whether to pour down with rain, but it takes a few minutes to set up the connections, whether we're down on the jetty or here in what's going to be sort of a center for students to come and explore the marine environment on Trunk Island. So hopefully, I'm just going to check all our different things. This tells me that video playback was interrupted when I'm looking at my preview screen. But it does seem that we are live. Fantastic. So here we go. Okay, yes, we're inside, and we've got various people from Romania, from Texas, West Virginia, Romania, Athens, London, and soon Bermuda. I imagine Bermuda, that's me. I don't know whether there are any other Bermudian schools or colleagues taking part. Before the questions start coming through, perhaps just explain to you a little bit about the coral reef. So the coral reef is further offshore, probably about 10, 11 miles. So some of the northerly areas of North Rock, 10, 11 miles from here. And we're actually in a sound, which is like a sort of kindergarten for the coral reef. So the coral reef isn't sort of a marine ecosystem that can survive just by itself. It needs these other connected ecosystems where different stages of a fish, for instance, or a lobster may live. So that we might have your mature lobsters on the reef, but you might have the juvenile lobsters here in a more protected sort of inland sound area. And then we have, of course, very famous part of the coral ecosystem, of course, is the coral reef itself. So here we have a brain coral, one of the more prevalent types of coral here in Bermuda. And for those of you who haven't met, as it were, corals before, they're made by a type of animal called the coral polyp, and that's related to jellyfish and anemones. And if you can imagine, if you've seen Finding Nemo, or you've ever seen an anemone in a rock pool in Scotland or somewhere on the shore somewhere else, then you'll know the sort of little tentacly type animal stuck to the bottom of the sea. And on this great star coral, you can perhaps more easily see where these anemones, these pockets of the anemones, might live. And so when we're talking about coral, we've got this sort of great big rock, and it's mineral from the sea. And the living tissue is just on the outside here with the coral polyps arranged as so. And you can see how, just by looking here, you can see how layers on layers of calcium carbonate of limestone have been laid down, and the coral growing sort of upwards and outwards the whole time. And so a coral this size, it's not a quick process. A coral this size may be taking sort of 20, 30 years to grow, maybe even more. You can in fact age a coral by taking a core and looking at the deposits of limestone, this calcium carbonate, over the years. It's a bit like tree rings, really, and that's how you age a coral. And so, in terms of how it grows, I mean, it grows from depositing these layers of limestone. But the actual animal, the coral polyp itself, coming back here, that grows. Interestingly, there's a process called budding, and that's where, when the coral polyp gets a bit bigger, imagine this started off with a single coral polyp growing a little bit of calcium carbonate structure, and then it splits into two, and then into two, and into two. So there's almost this cloning process, and that's how corals grow. Coral reefs grow. Is this layer upon layer of calcium carbonate being deposited, and then these coral polyps budding, splitting into two. There's also sexual reproduction, so sperm and eggs, and new corals growing out on the reef. Why is Bermuda special? Bermuda has a triangle, which is very, very special, and all a bit of a myth. We've had lots of questions about the Bermuda Triangle over the past couple of weeks, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But for me, what's been so special about it has been seeing amazing, lovely sea rods, soft corals, and also seeing lots and lots and lots of parrotfish, innumerate parrotfish. So it's been fantastic. Midnight, stoplight, rainbow parrotfish. It's been really wonderful being in the water with them. Why is coral bleaching so important for our planet? What causes it, and how can we prevent it? It's a really important issue and process to understand. So when we're looking at the effects of increased carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, we're also thinking about, well, why does that matter? How does that affect different environments in different ways? And one of the ways it affects the marine environment, the ocean, is by making it warmer. So what we've been hearing about in the news is the increased temperatures, global temperatures, and some of that temperature coming into the ocean. Now, we need to come back to understand coral bleaching. We need to come back to the coral animal, it says. So the animal that lives on the surface here and creates these amazing structures. Now we're going to be talking about sort of tropical reef forming, coral here. There are other corals, but we're just going to sort of call that coral for now before we get too complicated. Now, typically coral will get its food, a bit like an anemone, with tentacles, and it will get some of that food it will get from the sea. So it'll be little plankton and that kind of thing, and it'll get it in to bring it into its mouth. But in the clear tropical waters where coral likes to grow, there aren't enough nutrients to supply the coral polyp. So it has this algae inside it called zooxanthellae, and that's what gives the coral its color. So you'll see corals typically are these reddy, browny, greeny, yellowy colors, and that's from the algae living inside its tissue, and that supplies the coral polyp through photosynthesis with about 70 to 90% of its energy. Coral bleaching occurs because this coral likes to live in a fairly stable temperature band, so we're talking to mid to high 20 degrees Celsius. If the temperature goes above that, the relationship between the zooxanthellae, this algae that lives inside the coral tissue, and the coral polyp itself can break down, and the algae get expelled. gets basically chucked out. And because it's the algae that give the coral its color, and the polyp itself is sort of see-through, a bit like a jellyfish, what happens is you get, you can see through to the white. And it's a bleaching effect. So much like if we bleached clothes, they get whiter. If the coral bleaches, it gets this whiter color. Now, so that's the process, and it can lead to coral mortality if the coral doesn't have that energy from the zooxanthellae for a number of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. If it lasts for too long, then it's hard for the coral to recover, and it can die. So it is caused by a number of things, but most at the moment, these big mass bleaching events are caused by an increase in ocean temperature. And so how can we prevent it? We can all work towards reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and slowing the rise in ocean temperature. Where are we? Hi, Manuela. Great to see you, and lovely to see you here. And I hope your classes in Portugal are doing really well. Is the coral affected by cold weather? Yes. So at the lower end of the temperature range, it is also being affected. It hasn't been an issue at the moment, and in fact, having the coral in Bermuda, having that more of a seasonal variation, has actually seen that it hasn't the longer. It doesn't have, in Bermuda. You don't have those very long warm weather periods, and so if there is bleaching in the summer, there's quite often a sort of cooler water to come and help stop that bleaching event as well. Hurricanes, since time immemorial, for the past 500 odd million years since there's been coral, I imagine that hurricanes, I don't know exactly, but hurricanes are going to bash. The wave action is going to bash, the energy is going to bash the reef, and it's going to break it up. That is not a problem as long as the coral reef has time to recover. If it's getting bashed and bashed and bashed and bashed continuously, without any respite, without any break in between those hurricanes, then there is less time for the coral to recover, and that's when you might get an issue. How far away from a city is the research center? Well, where I am at the moment is really a sort of almost an outreach center for young Bermudians to discover the local environment, and we're, I don't know, a stone's throw from the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo, but Bermuda is quite a densely populated island. And so everything's near everything else. It's also quite a small island, but amazingly, also that means it's the reefs aren't as accessible as they might be in other places. You have to get quite far offshore, but the research centres and everything else are all fairly close to each other. How intense are the changes in the ecosystem of the reef as you go closer to cities and human activity? It really depends, and I wouldn't want to generalize here. So it's looking at a case-by-case basis. Certainly, I mean, in Bermuda, and I'm not exactly sure, but what I think is the case is that the main ports are built near areas which are accessible, which are deep water, which are clear of reefs. So reefs used to be sort of the word reef comes from sort of navigational issue, threat, basically. Rather than it being coral, sort of old sail, it's a reef. It's something I might crash into. So normally you don't have cities too near reefs because you don't want your city near a navigational problem. But certainly, cities can affect coral reefs in a few ways, one of which is pollution, sewage going into the water, which can cause algal overgrowth as well, having more nutrients. The lights from a city can confuse a number of marine animals, including the turtle, and debris and sort of dust and rubbish can make the water more turbid. And as we were speaking, turbid means basically cloudy. It's a sort of posh science word for cloudy. So these guys, because they've got lots of algae inside them, and that's where they're getting energy from. If the water's really cloudy, they don't have enough sunlight coming through, and that affects the amount of energy they're getting. Okay, when I was in Dubai, I picked up coral from Dubai Marina on the beach. Are they affected by the construction of the area and destroyed, so they reach the shore? It's difficult to, I don't know specifically about Dubai, but certainly, you know, if people are building in areas near reefs, then that they can be susceptible to being destroyed. So if you have bits of coral that breaking off, and this instance branching coral here, maybe it is being broken up by construction and then coming up to shore. I'm not sure, but wherever it is, we shouldn't be picking up and taking it home. These are specimens from the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo, so very kindly loaned to us for these couple of weeks. I think that all coral is now protected through CITES, so that there's no international trade in coral, which is excellent. Is the coral affected by other animals? So the coral ecosystem is very interdependent. So yes, so you have, for instance, parrotfish that are keeping the algae clear on the reef. You have sea urchins performing a similar role. You have so those are your herbivores, your grazers. You have sea cucumbers that are keeping disease down by clearing through some of the dead and dying tissue and matter or in the sand. You have just, I mean, I could go on. There's filter feeders, there's predators, there's all these different roles on the reef that different animals are doing. Do any marine animals eat it? I mean, the parrotfish does eat the coral, not on purpose. I mean, yes, on purpose, but to get the algae rather than to get the coral polyp itself. The other coralivore is the crinothorn starfish. It ejects its stomach, so it clamps on and ejects its stomach over the coral. Gastric juices dissolve all that into a nice mush, and then digests all that as well. Can sort of clean out a sort of coral reef. So the crinothorn starfish is one to look out for. How many years has your group been researching coral? Well, I'm very lucky to have joined a number of research expeditions to help with the outreach. So you've got the great experience from the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland when they joined the Axel Catlin Seaview Survey. So many years of researching corals, and then here working with people like Dr. Robbie Smith at the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo, and researchers at BIOS. It's been really great to have all that experience supporting us in our work. How does it feel, Manuela, how does it feel to touch a coral? So I'm just assuming that is that touching a structure like this, or touching a live coral? Get the hell in the water. Yes, I would love. I've just been in the water. I've just seen this this message here coming through. And we've been experimenting with different ways of broadcasting from underwater and near underwater. The connection is not good enough at the moment, and so we're further researching wide connections to take underwater, because the Wi-Fi signals and have not been strong enough to really give us good views underwater. So whilst I would love to be swimming along with you at the moment, showing you the reef, that we just don't have that really at the moment. So it's something to be worked on. Sorry, where are we? It's going down the list. What is the average lifespan of a coral? This coral is about 20-30 years old, or was 20-30 years old. It depends, you know, they're an animal, they grow. Sometimes they, the deep water corals, deep cold water corals, I think the oldest they've found is 4,000 years old. Some of the big coral bommies in the Pacific and on the Great Barrier Reef, hundreds of years old. Some of the quicker growing staghorn corals, sometimes, you know, 15-20 years. So there's and there's new coral all the time, and coral dying all the time. So they're not immortal. So it's you know, there's just a range of lifespans out there. How do you tell the types of coral apart? So, you know, I can just do just give you an example here. You know, we can see this is the greater and the lesser star coral. So types of star coral, you can see the difference. One's got a smaller polyp, one's got a bigger polyp. So that's a star coral. Let's compare the star coral to a bush coral. And we're really telling this is an ivory bush coral, and we're telling the difference by the shape. So for a long time, I'm going to go ivory bush coral back to brain coral. So for a long time, we're telling the difference between corals by their shape. Now, modern genetics methods are allowing scientists to differentiate even more. So just discussing yesterday, and the fact that whilst we may think there are, you know, just under 1,000 species of hard coral, there may be more, because two may look very similar, but using genetic methods, so we can actually find out that they're two different species. So very, very exciting time in science, looking at finding out exactly how many corals there are and moving beyond that sort of like, look, you know, it looks like this method. Let's see, go. So our teacher was told that people touching coral can kill it. Is it because of the oils of our hands? Yes, that it is to do with the oils and also the temperature. So the temperature in our bodies can also contribute to killing the coral. So really the moral in that story is don't touch coral. This is a dead skeleton of coral, so that's okay. And especially don't touch fire coral, because then that will give you a very sharp lesson. I was just having a look to see what's around in the water here just before this call, and there's some massive, I would call them stands of fire coral just around the corner. When you show that coral, can you tell how old it is by layers like a tree, or tree rings like a tree? You can, and the method you use is coring. So I don't have that with me here. So unfortunately, can't tell you exactly how old, or rather, other than a sort of look and reckon it's about sort of 20-30 years of growth. What kind of equipment have you used in the underwater broadcast? We enjoyed one earlier and was impressive. So we've been using just a mobile phone in a casing. We've also been wiring up Wi-Fi, so running very long cables of Wi-Fi and electricity down towards the water. So we've got a sort of a Wi-Fi box sort of next to the water almost. But still, it's been quite complicated to use, and we haven't been able to see what we're looking at very easily. Also, it's been cutting between the streams has been tricky. So it's one of those things that we're reviewing at the moment. I would love to, to be able to also, have a fully wired mask where we can actually just be underwater talking about stuff. So we'll see what we can do in the future. What do we have here? Is coral sharp enough to cut people? Diving suits? Yeah, I mean it's rock, and if you get sort of, you can see these. If I hold this up a bit closer, you can see this is made out of limestone, and it can cut you quite easily, and people, especially sort of, grazers and potentially even through thin dive suits. And the mucus layer, the layer of the tissue, can give you a nasty infection as well. So those can become very, very swollen and infected. We don't. I mean, I don't personally study sponges. I've got a couple of sponges here. And a more typical bathtubby type sponge. And I'm not sure how. There's a great question how they interact with corals, but sponges help to build up the underwater 3D habitat that gives space for a lot of other creatures. So as we're talking a lot about coral as a reef forming habitat, but sponges also help to build that habitat as well. And the other thing is, of course, it's not just the hard corals. I'm just getting a couple of soft corals out here. So let's turn this around so you can see it a bit more easily. Here we go. This is a sea rod. This type of soft coral that you can find in Bermuda. There we go. And this one, a sea fan, which I find rather lovely. Another type of soft coral found here. So all these different types of soft, hard coral and sponges helping to make the 3D habitat. In terms of the number of corals in Bermuda, there are, I think, just over 20 species of hard coral here. Brains and stars sort of maybe predominant. And that compares to about 75 species of coral in the Caribbean, to which Bermuda is connected in terms of many of its species. And then if you look then in the sort of like center of coral, the coral triangle, then you're looking at 700 plus different species of coral there. How deep can corals be seen? How deep? I mean, several thousand feet, and I don't know the deepest coral, but you get deep. So you get sort of three depths to think about in terms of coral. You've got your sort of your coral with your algae inside, with your symbiotic zooxanthellae. And that's where the coral's getting a decent whack of its energy from the sun powering those algae inside its tissue. So that obviously you're going to have more. You're going to get that coral in depths where you get sunlight. So that sort of 0 to 30, 40 meters typically is what you call your shallow reef. And then your deep reef, anything down from 40 to sort of 150, 120 meters. And then that's a sort of twilight reef, massive typically what we'll properly call the mesophotic zone. And then deeper, you've got deep cold water corals that, like Lophelia, that don't have the algae inside them that sort of gives them a superpower. And those are down to thousands of feet. And I don't know the depth, the sort of deepest corals being found. What can you do to help protect the corals in your area? So corals are facing a number of different threats, and so directly what we're looking at, I think, is what everybody can do. Is to share, first of all, share how awesome corals in the coral reef is. Second is to look at how we can curb the problems of ocean warming and ocean acidification, which are having a big impact on the reef and will do into the future, and that's by looking at emissions. So carbon emissions, and looking at what we can all do to work through those. Then looking at making sure that the way that we use reefs is sustainable. So on a local basis, that's really looking at sort of fishing practices, what we're taking out, what we're putting in, that kind of thing. And also, I think, looking at sort of some of the wider marine issues. So also looking at making sure we're not putting pollutants, plastics, those kind of things into the ocean. So there are a lot of things, even if you don't live near a reef, finding out more about the reef, cutting down on our emissions, cutting down on our overall resource use will contribute to a healthier coral reef. Now, Constanza, I've probably, you're going to have to help me with this one, because I've just got the corals bred, and there's probably more to it than that. So I'm going to wait to see how that question develops over a couple of iterations. What can you tell us about the Gulf Stream? The Gulf Stream is basically the reason why I've been swimming today, and there are corals in Bermuda. The Gulf Stream is an ocean current that takes warm water from the Caribbean up towards Northwest Europe, and then up to the Arctic. And it's driven by very salty water cooling in the Arctic and dropping and creating a dragging effect. So it drags the surface water, warm surface waters northwards, and then this deep water current is the cold waters returning, and that brings warm waters past Bermuda and allows corals to flourish here in the most northerly coral reef in the Atlantic. It's a process called thermohaline circulation, to get technical about the Gulf Stream. How does a coral reef start? It starts with a coral polyp. So you can let's look at so look at the coral polyp essentially fertilizing sort of sperm and egg. Then we have a larva, and then the larva will settle and develop into a coral polyp, and then start to take the minerals from the sea. And then when it gets a little bit bigger, it will split into two in budding, and then split into two, and again and again and again, and taking more minerals from the water, and over time growing the amazing reef. I'm just going to put the sea fan back gently here before it blows away. Now that I have been in Bermuda, what are my ideas about the Coral Triangle? I've discovered some very interesting things about the Coral Triangle. Just to the south of Bermuda, there is a massive whirlpool with a good half a dozen sea dragons, and they're largely responsible for all the mysterious aircraft and shipping accidents that have happened in the area over the past centuries. So if anybody asks you, pub quiz or whatever, that what is the problem of the Bermuda Triangle, it's whirlpools and sea dragons, honestly. It's all a myth invented by mermaids, is the real answer. So I'm just finding where we are. So I'm just going to have a cup of tea. That's okay. So I think there we have our. I think we're nearly at time. I think we've got time for one more question. But thank you very, very much for being part of this YouTube live broadcast. Do ask any other questions on our Twitter or Facebook pages. I think they're linked from our YouTube profile. And so, yeah, thank you very, very much for being part of this. We have one final session tomorrow. So gather your questions for that. Otherwise, it's thank you and goodbye from Bermuda. Thank you so much.